A quick note before we begin. This interview includes an account of the murder of the Romanov family and the especially brutal death of 17-year-old Grand Duchess Anastasia. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenis. So great to have you here with me. Well, I am extremely excited to have Penny Wilson and Greg King back again. A few weeks ago, they were my guests, and we explored the infamous Leopold and Loeb case. They are back to talk about a subject they have spent decades researching and writing about, Anastasia, the Grand Duchess who many believed escaped the massacre of the Romanov family in 1918 Russia. The book I read in preparation for this interview is called The Resurrection of the Romanovs, Anastasia, Anna Anderson, and the World's Greatest Royal Mystery. And again, here are the authors, Penny Wilson and Greg King. Great to have you both back.
Hey, thanks.
Thanks for having us again.
Yeah, so it's been over 20 years, right, that you've been studying the Romanov family and the claims made by this very interesting woman, Anna Anderson.
Oh, I would say for both of us,
and 40.
and for many, many, many other people who love Russian imperial and Romanov history, this started with the movie Nicholas and Alexandra. That was based on a book by Bob Massey, and really it brought the Romanovs from 1918 into the 1970s, and it was a great movie at the time. It's still a great movie today, and it was an introduction for most people to what happened to the Romanov family. And I remember myself, I can still remember today, sitting on the sofa back then in our family room and just being absolutely stunned into silence by that final scene. I had never conceived that anything like that could have happened. And I must have been 8, 9, 10 years old, maybe. And that started me on wanting to know more about these people. Obviously, I identified with the girls, being a girl myself at the time. And that sort of investigation, my dad taking me to the local library, kind of kickstarted the Anastasia part of the story for me because, you know, of course, at that time, we were still in the Cold War with Russia, and there had been no bodies found, no further word, I should say, after the 1918 period as to what might have happened. So in the West, of course, there were all kinds of rumors. As we found out when we researched this book, there were rumors about all the family having survived, each individual member having several claimants, there being groups of claimants claiming to be the entire family in a whole. But of course, Anna Anderson was head and shoulders above all the others. But yeah, my interest certainly started all the way back then when I was a kid.
Yeah, I mean, I came to it actually through Anastasia. If you remember, back in the 1970s, Leonard Nimoy used to host a show called In Search Of that was on every week. And one of the episodes was on Anna Anderson. And it's weird. There's a synchronicity to this that I have to think was fated because that was on a Saturday night. It was, 1977 or 78 when that episode premiered. I watched it that Saturday night. That same Saturday night, local TV channel was showing the movie Nicholas and Alexandra. And the next night, I lived close to Canada, so we always got the CBC from Canada. And the next night, the CBC was showing the 1956 Ingrid Bergman film, Anastasia. So I got 3 doses within about 30 hours, and that got me hooked on the entire story.
Why is this story so compelling for people, do you think?
Well, I don't know how to describe it. I don't know if it's sort of a romance with a capital R, the hope that someone might have survived, someone might have come out of that room. There's always in a person, there's always like a hope that even through terrible events, something positive can come. So I think that's the hook. Plus the eternal, what I went through, which was, yes, she did survive. No, she didn't survive. Yes, she did survive. She couldn't possibly have survived. The ping-ponging back and forth with no apparent possibility of a real answer to the question. It, sort of keeps bringing you back in.
Well, plus, I think there's this whole sort of nostalgic romanticism that surrounds the Romanovs and has since Massey's book was published in 1967. And so you get a family that's well documented, thousands of photos, and people can see them, identify them. We've read their love letters. So there's an immediacy to this family that really doesn't exist with a lot of historical figures. And you have this great drama, the Russian Revolution and Rasputin and the Bolsheviks and this dramatic execution. Everything kind of wraps itself together to make this a compelling story that's really lasted throughout the 20th century.
And also I was thinking just this last couple of days as I revisited our book. So the murder happened in 1918, and I myself was born in 1964. So that's less than 50 years after they were killed. And yeah, they looked a lot different. They dressed a lot differently. They behaved differently. They were from the other side of the world, but they were still close enough to touch because there was very good photography of them. There was film footage of them, loads of books, loads of people still alive that knew them. I mean, I myself, not so many years ago, prior to her death, was in touch with their cousin, Princess Vera. Now, she was exceedingly long-lived, but yeah, right up through the early 21st century, there were people still alive that remembered these people. And now myself, being 58 years old, I really realize how short a period of time that 50 years is.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. People have such a connection to this family over 100 years later. And there's a belief by many, I think, that this was a family who truly loved each other. They were each other's close friends, which is different than how we see members of the British royal family, for example, act towards each other today.
Well, again, I think a lot of our connection to them has to do with the fact that they left so much of themselves behind, so many photographs and beautifully composed ones of, the lovely girls in their picture hats and the cute little boy and the parents so obviously in love with each other. But the story itself, as you step back and take a look at it, maybe even from a historian's point of view, it's a very sweeping sort of epic tale. It's got everything. It's got a world war. It's got a revolution. It's got a mad monk. It's got a family, isolated in their palace, surrounded by revolutionaries. It packs a punch, even from the point of view of a historian, where you have to sort of hold yourself back from the emotional attachment, and you have to sort of, tell the story according to the documents and what we know about them. You can do that, but still the documents themselves build such a complete picture of, as you say, a lovely, admirable, to all outward appearances, perfect family, although we all know that, all families have some trouble or other. But yeah, it's kind of both. It's like a great historical tale with some very exciting historical framing, but it's also an intimate tale of a family. And I think that's something that gets to everyone.
I mean, there's a mythic quality to Nicholas and Alexandra. Like, you don't really get a lot of royal couples that have that depth of devotion, and the love affair has sort of become legendary. And you have the tragedy of their only son having hemophilia, going through that draws Rasputin into the picture. Four girls who never got a chance to grow up beyond the age of 23. They were all lovely, beautiful girls with different personalities, and they conflicted with each other and their parents like any normal girls would. But, it's heartbreaking when you think that Marie, who was the third daughter, she, even as a prisoner of the Bolsheviks, she kept talking about how her only goal was to get married and have lots of children. And, these are lives that could have been transformed. I mean, one of those daughters could have been the Queen of England had things worked out in the war and the revolution not interfered. So it's a tale of what ifs as well.
Right. So much of your book is about Anastasia. Whether or not she survived the massacre, whether a woman named Anna Anderson was in fact the real Anastasia. But let's talk about the real Anastasia. Can you tell us about her personality, etc.?
Sure. Anastasia was born in 1901. She was the fourth daughter and the fourth child of Nicholas and Alexandra. So when she arrived, because the throne could only pass to females after all legitimate males were depleted, Nicholas really needed a son. And so a fourth daughter arriving was basically greeted with horror in much of Russia and even amongst relatives in the imperial family. So Anastasia kind of grew up ignored. She was the least important of the kids. She was sort of a contradictory mix. She had a lively and inquisitive mind, but she was also a bit of a holy terror. She used to terrorize her tutors. She used to mock people, make fun of them to their face, do impressions of them. There are tales about her being quite nasty when playing with their cousins. So she had a sort of a ignored child syndrome thing going on with her, where she was allowed to give free rein basically to her worst elements in a lot of ways, although she began to grow out of that in time. But she was sort of known as the comic of the family. She would cheer everyone up, and she really was quite smart, although perhaps not in a general educational way. She had a lot of smarts about her.
I think she was your typical, I guess, middle child, even though she was the fourth of five. As Greg said, she was the youngest and probably dynastically speaking, the least important of the children. Her younger brother took primacy. So before he was born, she was just the youngest of four daughters. And on the day she was born, rather than join Alexandra with the new baby, Nicholas went for a walk, right, Greg? He, if I'm remembering correctly, he went out and just went for a walk in the garden. So was that?
I think that was with Marie.
Was that with Marie?
Daughter. Yeah.
Okay.
He probably locked himself in his study and drank something with Anastasia's birth.
Well, my memory might be faulty on that, but certainly the arrival of a fourth daughter would have been
a huge disappointment.
And a blip rather than the 300 gun salute that they would have had she been a boy. So she started life as the least of the daughters. She was pretty shortly followed by her brother. And then, of course, all family attention surrounded him. And then within the family dynamic, Alexandra was off and on and increasingly ill. Nicholas was busy running the country. Her older sisters were pretty involved in their schoolwork and various hobbies. So she was mostly paired with her the third sister, Marie, and sometimes with Alexei. But Yeah, I think she and her sister Marie in particular were maybe subject to middle child syndrome, where there was a lot of acting out, maybe for attention.
Yeah, and they are the definite Jan Bradys of the Romanov family.
So remind us again, if you don't mind, the circumstances surrounding the arrest of the family. How and why were they taken?
Right. Well, after the revolution in 1917, when that broke out, Nicholas II was at Army headquarters, and he was forced to abdicate essentially because of the chaos. The government fell, his army command really demanded that he step aside. And so he did so and returned to his family. They were imprisoned in the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, which was their normal residence outside of St. Petersburg. And they stayed there throughout the summer of 1917. In August 1917, Alexander Kerensky, who headed the provisional government at that time, decided to send them away from the capital because of the growing power of the Bolsheviks, who obviously were set on vengeance and wanted to kill the family. So they were sent to a small town called Tobolsk in Siberia, and they stayed there until April of 1918. During that interval, of course, Kerensky's government fell and he was replaced by Lenin, and it was under the Bolshevik regime that the family was finally taken from Tobolsk to the city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, still in Siberia. And they're imprisoned in a villa called the Apatyev House. And they stayed there for, I think, just over 2 months and were imprisoned with a few servants and kind of cramped in uncomfortable quarters and subjected to obviously an invasive presence of Bolshevik guards surrounding them. And that situation went on until the early morning hours of July 17th, 1918, when the entire family was taken down to the basement of the house and was executed.
Much of the myth surrounding the family in that period of captivity had to do with their final days. It has long been claimed that they were treated extremely cruelly, humiliated. Can you talk about the myths surrounding those last days and what you found to be true?
Well, there were a lot of stories that came out from the emigres who left Russia and former monarchists. They would claim that the doors were all taken off their hinges so the family had no privacy, that they were only given like 3 spoons divided between a family of 7 and the 4 servants that were with them, that soldiers entered their room day and night, made lewd jokes, made the Grand Duchesses sing revolutionary songs at the piano, grabbed food out of the Tsar's hands while he was eating. None of this stuff was true. And, it became an exaggerated way, I think, for a lot of the surviving monarchists and the Russian emigres to, in a way, portray the Bolsheviks in an even worse light. They obviously killed the family, but it was better to go a step further and really heighten the suffering that they imagined the imperial family had gone through in Yekaterinburg, because the worse they had been treated, the worse the Bolsheviks seemed to the emigres.
Now the White Army, right, had been approaching in the days leading up to their murders. Do you think that was the main reason they were killed? The Bolsheviks were worried this approaching army would take the family?
I certainly think that's a possibility, although, of course, the White Army was not completely made up of monarchists. There were many factions involved in the White Army. But I do think had the White Army taken Ekaterinburg, then I do think the family would not have been killed. They would have saved them. But I also, I also wonder what the possibilities would have been really of any chance of survival with Lenin and Trotsky and, all those boys at the head of the Kremlin committees back in Moscow. From their point of view, there couldn't be any real survival, because if they cut that cord and they killed as many Romanovs as possible, they sort of burned that bridge behind them. There's no going back to a monarchy. The country can only go forward into whatever the Bolshevik revolutionaries wanted to create. How many Romanovs were killed?
Yeah, they killed 18 members of the family within 6 or 7 months.
And every single member of the family who was taken to what they called the Red Urals, which would be Nicholas Alexandra, their 5 kids, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, Grand Duke Serge, Grand Duke Michael, and 4 lesser princes. They were the ones that were taken and imprisoned in and around Ekaterinburg and Perm, and not one of them survived. And in fact, Grand Duke Michael's body is still missing to this day. So, yeah, I mean, to go back to your question, I do think the whites would have made a difference to their survival, but I don't think there could have been any survival anyway under the Reds.
So the family kept jewels with them while they were held, jewels meant for bribes, in case there was an opportunity to escape. But no escape ever came, of course. Do you know why Nicholas II didn't actively try to use these jewels for that purpose?
Well, yeah, we do ponder that in both The Fate of the Romanovs and in this book. They had something like the equivalent of $12 million worth of diamonds and pearls and emeralds and things with them. And they easily could have bought their freedom, paid off all of the guards surrounding them. But I think they couldn't possibly conceive of a situation in which they were all about to be killed. So it's Nicholas and Alexandra had a certain myopic view throughout his reign, throughout their lives, of the situation, and they earnestly believed that Russians really loved them and they wouldn't harm them. And so they made no efforts to try to do that at a time when they could have. And, they ended up basically wearing a lot of those jewels under their clothing when they went into that cellar and were shot.
Yeah, they certainly went into captivity in Tobolsk, having packed their train, the Red Cross train that took them from St. Petersburg to Tobolsk. They certainly packed that train with all manner of valuables, paintings, carpets, furniture, and more portable things like their jewelry and so forth. And then as the days wound down, I think a lot of those things were stolen from them. A lot of them were stolen from storage. When they were in Tobolsk, they did shed a lot of the smaller items by dispersing it to various trusted people throughout the city, carried from them to those trusted people by their servants. In the 1930s, a good number of those valuable pieces were discovered in Tobolsk after an investigation by the NKVD, and a good number of people were actually shot and killed because of their involvement with that. So once they got to Ekaterinburg, their burdens were lightened. Certainly, they didn't have as much stuff with them. And as soon as they got into that house, the 70-some days they were in there, they just really didn't have a chance to do very much with that, except, as Greg said, hide it on their persons.
So the family, as they were marched down to the cellar, they were not aware of the fate that awaited them, right? They didn't believe that they were about to be killed. They were told they were going to be taken somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, they had absolutely no idea they were about to be shot. In fact, when Yurovsky, who was the head of the Cheka and in charge of the Apatiev house and the prisoners, when he came into the room surrounded by his armed Cheka men, and they brandished their revolvers and pointed them at the family, he told Nicholas that he was about to be shot, that the entire family had been condemned to death by the Ural Regional Soviet. And Nicholas said, what? What? So he clearly hadn't been expecting anything, and he asked Yurovsky to repeat it again because he didn't understand. So yeah, it came as a complete surprise to them. They weren't expecting it.
And just a little snippet, and probably nothing that's really pertinent, but many years before this, when the eldest daughter, Olga, was a relatively young girl, she was studying history with one of her tutors, and they were covering the story of Marie Antoinette and her husband, Louis. And Olga made a comment to the effect that she was happy to be living in a time filled with good people where a thing like that couldn't possibly happen. So, I mean, of course, that's relatively meaningless, but it doesn't appear to really have crossed their minds until the very, very last moments of their lives, which I think is fortunate for them.
Right, yeah. In an account from one of the guards, it was reported that Anastasia had attempted to fight back. She wasn't killed instantly.
Well, two of the girls, Olga and Tatiana, were shot in the head in that room. But Marie and Anastasia, when they were taken out, they were stabbed, they were chased. The men tried to shoot at them, but because they were wearing jewels sewn into their corsets, the bullets wouldn't penetrate. And so they tried to stab them and beat them. Their knives wouldn't go through the corsets. So they were essentially stabbed and beaten as best as the men could do, but they weren't dead when they were taken out of that room, because as they were being loaded into a waiting truck with the other bodies, both Marie and Anastasia started screaming. And it was outside at almost 3 a.m. in the morning at this point. And the men decided they couldn't open fire. Bullets hadn't worked so far. So they grabbed some rifles and turned the butts around, and they just battered them in the heads until they fell silent. So that's how they actually died. So those two girls left the room alive.
I think it would be important to remember also that the group of assassins, they were not in any way trained assassins. They had no experience in doing this before. They were mostly local young men who just a couple of months before had been working in the local factories. You know, they had little experience in guard duty, let alone in killing people. And in fact, the actual murder happened in a couple of waves. You know, they went in, they drew their revolvers. Each one had been assigned a person to shoot. They shot, some of them shot wide, some of them may have nicked a leg or an arm. Only 3 or 4 of the 11 in that room were killed in the first volley, and then everybody sort of went outside of the room and, had to gather themselves together and go back in for a second round. So it was horrible. It was brutal. It wasn't as clean as the movies would have you think. I don't think. And there were indeed some accounts of the murder left from people who took part in it, and also people who watched through a window in the side of the room, the basement room.
Yeah. So once the White Army arrives, they rush to the house in the hopes that they would find the family. And of course they don't. And they then began an investigation.
Yeah, the house was abandoned. They found the basement room full of bullet holes. But the Bolsheviks had announced that Nicholas had been killed, but the rest of the family had been moved to a safe place. So the White Army actually had 3 investigations, three investigators, one after the other, who spent the next year in Ekaterinburg trying to figure out what had happened. And they determined that the family was killed, but they decided, or Nicholas Sokolov, who was the last investigator, he came up with a theory that the family had been taken out to a place called the Four Brothers Mine Shaft in a forest outside of Yekaterinburg, and that their bodies had been chopped apart, burned, and what was left was dissolved in acid. And that accounted for the lack of human remains. What actually happened, of course, was that the Bolsheviks tried to dispose of the bodies at the Four Brothers mine and found that they couldn't do it. They were forced to take the bodies back and haul them through the forest a couple of times. And finally, when the truck carrying the bodies broke down, they just dug a hole and buried them in the middle of the road. And no one thought to look there, and that grave remained hidden until 1989.
Yeah. So, February 1920, a young woman is found in a canal, struggling to stay above water. Can you tell us more about the condition this young woman was in when she was found and where she was taken?
It was February in Berlin, so it was really cold. And a patrolling policeman was crossing one of the bridges across the Landwehr Canal in a Berlin park. And he heard someone struggling in the water beneath. So he went down to help. And he saw a young woman in the water struggling, probably, with the ice, trying to get to the bank. And he helped her out. And she wouldn't tell him who she was. When he asked her, "What's your name? How did you come to be in the water?" She wouldn't respond to him. She wouldn't answer. And because, according to their rules, in his opinion, she didn't appear to be very capable of looking after herself at that point. So he took her to a local hospital and checked her in.
Right. And so she stayed at that hospital for a few months. She still refused to give her name. No one could figure out who she was. The Berlin police came, tried to investigate, but had no leads to follow. After a few months, she was moved to the Daldorf Asylum in Berlin, and she would spend the next 19 months there, basically refusing to talk to most people, refusing to reveal her name, giving no hints about her identity.
And she had lacerations on her body, right?
Well, she has some. She's got a few minor scars. Part of the legend is that she emerged from that canal bearing traces of bullet wounds and a wound through her foot that was in the shape of a triangular Russian bayonet, and that she had been severely battered over the head. It's true that she had a couple of fractured jaws and, a few scars, but the myth about Anna Anderson is that her body bore this mute evidence of the massacre in Ekaterinburg. And in fact, none of the doctors, as we found out when we went back to the original reports, recorded any of that. It's all part of the myth.
So at what point during her recovery is there a suspicion that she might be a survivor of the Romanov family massacre? And by the way, she's not believed to be Anastasia at first, right? It's Tatiana.
One of the other inmates at the Daldorf was a woman called Clara. And Clara had been watching, I suppose, the woman who would be identified as a Romanov. And she was the one that initially made the connection. There were a lot of magazines laying around. The patients at the Daldorf would often read these picture magazines, very much like today's People magazine, Us Weekly, that sort of thing. And of course, it being 1920 or 21 by this time, and just 2 or 3 years after the alleged Romanov massacre at the time, just like you said, the fascination with royalty today and what's going on with the Windsors and so forth, it was still very much that sort of thing going on with the Romanovs, what really happened. Did, of course, anyone survive? Because there were claimants showing up in the very first few days after the murder. There was an Alexei claimant while the children's French tutor was still in Siberia, and he had to meet him and say, no, that's not Alexei. But they were showing up already. So this sort of stuff was in these magazines that the patients at Daldorf had ready to hand for them to read. And I suppose Clara was looking, at these magazines, and then she was seeing Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown, as they called this patient. And she saw a resemblance between Fräulein Unbekannt and Grand Duchess Tatiana. And she took that piece of information, that piece of detective work, to the nurses. And then again, once she herself was released, she took it to the outside world. And it sort of gained traction with the emigre Russian community in Berlin at the time.
Yeah, I mean, Anna Anderson she never claimed to be Tatiana. That was Clara's mistake, because she had actually talked to a nurse, and one night before Clara was admitted to the asylum, Anna Anderson had actually pointed to a magazine cover with the picture of Anastasia and told the nurse that was who she was. So that was the first time that she claimed to be the Grand Duchess. But there was a lot of confusion, as Penny says, because you had two different versions, which girl was she supposed to be? And that caused a lot of confusion.
And then a lady called Zinaida Tolstoy came to the Daldorf to visit the patient. She had been an intimate of Empress Alexandra and was certainly very familiar with each of the Grand Duchesses in life. And she had probably seen them during the war. So 1916, 1917, and now here we were 4 or 5 years later, something like that. So she felt she had a decent shot at identifying her if it was indeed one of the Grand Duchesses. And she went in expecting to see Tatiana, but upon seeing Fräulein Unbekannt laying in her bed, and she could see her full length, she said, no, this isn't Tatiana, she's too short.
One of the distinguishing physical features Anastasia had was a foot deformity, right?
Anastasia suffered from hallux valgus, which is essentially really pronounced bunions on the side of the foot. And so did Anna Anderson, coincidentally. And that was one of the things that, it seemed like a really strange coincidence that this woman claiming to be Anastasia would have the same foot deformity as the real Grand Duchess, which, of course, sort of lent authenticity to her claim, right?
One of the ways this young woman was compared to Anastasia, their weights were compared, right?
Right. Well, she had been, sort of pudgy and used to make fun of her for that. But, by the time the revolution came around and their incarceration in Tobolsk and in Ekaterinburg, she actually grew quite thin. So at the end of her life, Anastasia had sort of lost the plumpness of her youth at that point,
And also, just to jump in here, I wanted to check something. I didn't want to speak without being sure of it. But back to the hallux valgus. Yes, Anastasia had it, and yes, Fräulein Unbekannt had it, but so too does 23% of the population between the ages of 18 and 30. So while yes, it's certainly coincidental they both had it, it certainly wasn't a rare condition.
Right. So a lot of attention was put on what languages this young woman could speak. Could she speak Russian, English, German? Her mother was German.
Right.
The duchesses had been taught French as well.
Well, the Grand Duchesses certainly learned English and Russian at home, quote unquote. Their mother was German, but she was her own mother, Princess Alice of Great Britain and Ireland. She had died of diphtheria when she was Princess Alex at that time, when she was how old?
6.
6. So she was taken to England, and essentially, for all intents and purposes, she was raised by Queen Victoria. So yes, Alex spoke German and English. And I think when she first met Nicholas, until she herself perfected her Russian, she and Nicholas spoke English to each other.
Yeah, that was the family language. So all of the kids grew up pretty much speaking English with their mother. With their father, they spoke Russian.
They spoke Russian, and they learned French at home with their tutor, Pierre Gilliard. And they also learned a certain amount of German too, although that piece of information was, of course, suppressed during the war because, who wants to learn German when you're at war with Germany?
Yeah, but when it came to Anna Anderson, I mean, the argument about what languages she spoke and what languages she understood went on for 40 years. And there was very little consensus about it, but I mean, what we were able to find out going through all of the reports was basically that she could understand Russian. She would occasionally mutter a few sentences or a few words in Russian, but that was the extent of her demonstrated ability. She did not seem to have much understanding of English. She spoke perfect German, which was ironic because that was the least of the languages that the 4 Grand Duchesses would have learned. And she had very little ability in French. But she got around the especially difficult problem of not speaking Russian by claiming that the wounds to her head had damaged her memory and that she had forgot all of her Russian. And her supporters went along with that and thought, okay, that's an explanation as why she won't speak Russian.
Did she also not say she wouldn't speak Russian because it was the last language she heard in that house?
Right. So she gave a variety of excuses.
Probably depended who she was, talking to and how their conversation was developing. She was a very skillful manipulator of people and their emotions and needs, I think.
In comparing photographs, the noses are different, the chins are different, and her explanation was that she had received wounds to her face.
Right. Well, yeah, there were a number of studies during the various trials that went on with forensic anthropologists and various people arguing back and forth and doing their photographic studies and comparing noses and ears and chins. And nothing was ever definitive on those. But yeah, anytime somebody would say, well, her face is different from the Grand Duchess's, her supporters or Anna Anderson would say, well, I got bashed in the jaw. I got hit over the head. My face has a different shape now because of my wounds. So they used that to, relieve a lot of the pressure of the physical resemblance not being quite up to par.
Right. So how does the news that she might be the real Grand Duchess Anastasia, how is that received by the public and from relatives, from the people who knew the real Anastasia?
I think initially the public response was very minimal. I don't think it was such huge news to people then. Certainly among the Russian emigre community, it caused a certain amount of reaction. And when she did at last leave the Waldorf, she went to stay with a family of Russian emigres who, I'm not sure how much they believed in her claimed identity, but they certainly wanted to take her off the street and wanted to give her a place to further recover where maybe the community could delve into her story and try and determine who she was, and if indeed she was Anastasia, how best they could get news to her family, because, of course, Her family in Berlin didn't exist anymore because the Kaiser had been deposed and he was living in Holland, and her grandmother was in her own home country of Denmark. So it took a little bit of time to get word to them. And eventually Anastasia's aunt, her father's sister, the emperor's sister, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, came to Berlin to visit her. And Olga Alexandrovna was an extremely kind woman, and her kindness and gentleness towards the patient, even though she did not identify her as Anastasia, her kindness and gentleness were taken as some form of recognition. And you know how tabloid news is, it just kind of takes an idea and runs with it. And I think that is where the big media hoo-ha and the big public hoo-ha began.
Yeah, you had, in this case, dozens of people, various relatives and peripheral members of the former Tsarist suite who had, in one capacity or another, known the real Anastasia. I mean, they came and they met her, and most of those who had known Anastasia actually came down against Anna Anderson's claim. And so the family, basically, the only members of the real Anastasia's family who sort of recognized her were, I guess the most important was one of Anastasia's cousins, Prince Sigismund of Prussia. And he helped support her for the rest of his life and made sure that his fellow exiled royals and aristocrats helped take care of her financial bills and gave her places to stay.
I also think that it would be important to remember that a lot of these peripheral members of the suite actually worked for Nicholas or for Alexandra or for the household. And think yourself in your own job. If you're you go to work for your boss and you're working in whatever setting you're in, and then one day the door opens and his kids come in, and you might see them, but you don't interact with them on a daily basis. So if you've seen them run through the office or go down the hallway or cross the garden half a dozen times a year, would you necessarily recognize the youngest and least important one 5 or 6 years after she was allegedly murdered? Some people might have more confidence in that sort of identification than I do, but I didn't put an awful lot of faith in that kind of identification. I was looking for something from an intimate family member like Grand Duchess Olga, because of course Prince Sigismund didn't see Anastasia often or even frequently. Didn't he recognize her by her voice?
He had last seen her in 1912, and that was the first time that he had seen her for at least 3 years prior to that. So, I mean, he didn't have a running relationship with her. And, it was the way that she held herself and this supposed memory or that supposed memory, things that she actually could have picked up in books that she had, that so impressed a lot of people and convinced them that, well, only the real Anastasia would know this. Only the real Anastasia would be able to do intricate embroidery. Only the real Anastasia would have the bearing that Anna Anderson had. And so there were a lot of things that played into it that were sort of intangibles that really built one upon the other to provide this picture that really the foundations of it were non-existent, but hope drove all of these people. They wanted to believe that Anastasia had survived.
And they certainly didn't have any proof that she hadn't survived. If they say if there's a murder, there's got to be a body. Well, there wasn't a body, so they had no proof of a murder.
Speaking of that, yeah, What was Anna Anderson's story? How did she explain her escape from death?
Well, her story was that when the shooting started, she fainted. And as the bodies were being loaded into the truck to be taken away, one of the soldiers realized that she was alive, dragged her off the truck, and spirited her off into a forest where she lived with a family while she recuperated. Soldier that she gave him the name of Alexander Tchaikovsky. And supposedly he and a brother helped take her out of Russia through Romania using jewelry sewn in her clothing to help pay for the trip and pay off border guards because she didn't, of course, have papers. So that was basically her story of how she escaped. She fainted and was rescued by a soldier, and then the two brothers got her out of Russia to safety in the West.
And she further revealed that during that time she was being hidden, she became romantically involved with a guard. Is that right?
Yeah, she said that she had an affair with Tchaikovsky and given birth to his child. And of course, that didn't go over well with the emigre community or Romanov relatives who may have been uncertain about whether she was or was not Anastasia. In fact, Anna Anderson had been pregnant at some point. We don't know whether she gave birth or had an invasive abortion, but there was evidence from a gynecological examination conducted in the 1950s that at least supported the premise that she had been pregnant at some point.
So this young woman, Anna Anderson, really has to make a decision at some point. It's all or nothing on this. You know, if she commits to this story, she's going to have to do it for the rest of her life. There's really no turning back. Is there evidence that she studied the family to help perpetuate her tale?
Well, first of all, the story that Greg just told of the escape and Alexander Tchaikovsky, none of that obviously happened. And the actual person who was Anna Anderson had never been in Russia and Romania. So to that extent, I think she was just winging the story, trying to figure out what would fit the known details. She also, I don't think she studied the Romanov family before she was identified with Anastasia, but I think afterwards, I think she did her homework.
Yes.
I think she listened to people when they came to see her more than spoke to them. I think she listened. And of course, that's a good interview technique, isn't it? You remain silent and someone will jump in to fill the vacuum. So she remained silent and someone would tell them of their memories of the real Anastasia. And of course, she would remember that. And then she would repeat those memories in conversation with a subsequent person. And that person would say, hey, wow, she remembered this happening with this person, and we know that happened, so she must be who she says she is.
Yeah, and she was pretty diligent. The people that she lived with constantly provided her with the latest books about the Romanovs, memoirs of people who had served at the court, illustrated magazines. She had a collection of hundreds of photographs and postcards of the Romanovs and their relatives, and she would sit in her bedroom and spread them out over her bed and study the faces so that if she was quizzed or she met someone, she would at least have a leg up and might be able to identify them if she saw them or was given a photograph and asked, do you know this person? Do you remember this person? So she put a lot of effort into that, although she was pretty cagey about the way that she did it. She always claimed that her memory was so damaged and she was just trying to refresh her memory and trying to remember things that she had forgotten. And, people let her get away with that.
So as all this unfolds, she becomes more and more a celebrity. Does she embrace it? How does she react to it all? This controversy that's swirling around her.
She became very difficult, I think. right?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't in her best interest to promote her claim. It was better to have it remain a mystery, because if she really pushed for identification, then she would be exposed as a fraud. So she wouldn't cooperate with anyone trying to really prove that she was Anastasia, but she made efforts to surround herself with enough lingering mystery that the question could never really be settled. And that was to her advantage.
She had issues with mood swings, right? Over the years, frequent depression.
Well, you have to think of how she was living, the stress of her day-to-day existence as she bounced from this household to that one, to this relative to that one, always dependent on their goodwill and their belief in her.
And
Some
always being afraid that she would be exposed. She had to live with
and
that.
some of the people were good and decent people, and some really weren't. So she was must have been under tremendous stress on a day-to-day basis, and finally I really believe there was a breakdown of sorts, and of course when she was in New York that happened, right? And she went to
Yeah.
the Four Winds.
Four Winds Asylum. She was sent to a few asylums. I mean, she was notoriously difficult. She was temperamental. She would rage and shout at people. She alienated her supporters. There was no real evidence of any mental instability. All of the doctors and psychiatrists who examined her in the 20s and the 30s couldn't find anything organically wrong with her. But, as she obviously became older, those tendencies became more pronounced, and she spent the last 10 years of her life basically senile, and was an incredibly difficult person at that point.
I'd really like to see a forensic psychiatric team take a look at her documented mental life and see what they come up with, because like I said, I really doubt there's very many people who have lived that sort of existence, let alone being able to know what kind of stress that was.
What were some of the stranger things she did?
Well, I'm thinking more or less of her time in America when she came to America. I mean, she married a professor, retired professor, lived in Charlottesville, Virginia. She turned his elegant little house into a garbage dump. She had rotting eggshells on the floor and dozens of cats, and refused to clean up after them. And she would burn their bodies in the fireplace when they died. There's this assortment of rubble, and she was living like that in Germany before she came to America. One of our friends who helped us with this book, a man named Ian Lilburn, who kind of served as her unofficial representative in England in the 1960s, he had to go in and clean out her house in Germany. And he told us about walking in there and finding layers of dog and cat feces covering signed photographs of Nicholas and Alexandra and other royalty. So he had to try to salvage this amazing jumble of stuff out of the wreckage that she made of wherever she ended up.
So a hoarder, certainly, with probably everything that means attached to it.
Right.
And throughout the course of her life, she attempted, through legal means, to be declared.
Yeah, she had there was some money that was deposited in the Mendelssohn Bank in Berlin before the outbreak of the First World War. And it stayed there. And in 1933, a Berlin court granted certificates of inheritance to that money to surviving members of Nicholas and Alexander's family. And so Anna Anderson's lawyers decided that they ought to sue for a share of that money. And they started lodging protests and doing things like that. The action was interrupted by the Second World War, and it didn't really pick up again until 1956. But her lawyers decided to sue, actually, the real Anastasia's aunt's granddaughter, Barbara of Mecklenburg. because she had been a peripheral heir and had received some of this money. And Anderson she could care less about it. Basically, she refused to cooperate with her lawyers even, because, again, obviously it was in her best interests if, she didn't push too hard and be exposed as a fraud. So she never really cooperated in those efforts, but she went along with them reluctantly, I think, because I think deep down she probably knew there was going to be no resolution either way. Nobody could prove or disprove anything at that point.
And this was, after World War II, so it was 30 years after her initial appearance. And everything that had happened since then only served to muddy the waters. It just added more layers of people who believed her, people who didn't. This forensic expert thought this, that forensic expert thought that. And of course, they were using forensic quote unquote sciences that we just don't use anymore, like graphology, examining her handwriting. And didn't someone examine her skull, her...
Yeah, I mean, they were taking measurements of
ears
and noses and the bridges and the distance between this eye and that eye. It's all so intangible, and it would never have proved anything anyway, because Anna Anderson clearly had suffered a lot of facial injuries at some point, so she could always account for any discrepancy by referencing that.
How did she get the name Anderson?
That was actually when she was in America. Gleb Botkin, whose father, Eugene Botkin, had been the imperial physician to Nicholas and Alexandra and was imprisoned and was shot with them in Yekaterinburg. He became one of her supporters, and he checked her into the Garden City Hotel on Long Island. And he didn't want to check her in under any name that the press would recognize. And so he came up with the pseudonym Anna Anderson. And that, from that point on, became the name that she used regularly and the name by which she became famous or infamous.
So for those who didn't believe her, did anyone ever try and find out who she really was? Her real name, identity?
There were numerous attempts to try to figure out who she was. The most important of those was in 1927. A Berlin newspaper broke the story that she was actually a woman named Franziska Shenskowska, who had been born in what was West Prussia and is now part of Poland. And Empress Alexandra's brother, the Grand Duke of Hesse, helped finance an investigation. Journalists and detectives went and interviewed Franziska's family, and her family readily identified Anna Anderson as their missing daughter and sister. And there were several confrontations over the years. Unfortunately, the family sort of tied itself up into legal knots over the case because they didn't want to be responsible for her hospital bills and for paying any money, that she had received from supporters. And so they were kind of forced to a position where one day they would recognize her and sign affidavits saying, yes, it's Franziska Shenskowska, only to later backtrack and say, well, on second thought, it's not really our sister or our daughter. And so that kind of went on, but it became a sort of fixture of the court case in the 1950s, with people trying to determine was she really Franziska or not. And up through the very end of the court case in 1970, when the West German Supreme Court handed down a verdict saying that the case was unsolvable, that she hadn't proved that she was Anastasia, but her detractors hadn't proved that she wasn't Anastasia. No one could really prove anything. And so the only identity that she was really suspected of having was this Franziska Shenskowska, this missing girl from modern Poland who had disappeared coincidentally about 3 weeks before Anna Anderson showed up in Berlin.
Do you think that at some point in her life, she actually began believing her own lies?
Toward the end, I think she did, probably as she got into the late 60s, the early 70s, and especially after she started to slide into dementia, certainly. But she'd spent 3/4 of her life living as Anastasia, and it really was sort of her reality. Her identity as Anastasia was more real to her than her identity as Franziska Shanskowska had been. So she sort of became the Grand Duchess in her own mind.
And you have to wonder how satisfying that existence would have been. People presume that she got into this claimant situation in order to, win fame and fortune, particularly fortune, but she really didn't. And really what she traded her Franziska Shanskowska identity for was sort of a wild, uncertain, constantly changing fight centered around a denial of herself. And of course, in the end, you have to wonder how much that contributed towards her dementia.
What do you think was her initial motivation in concocting this story?
She had worked in a munitions factory, and one day while she was at work, she dropped a bomb, I suppose, or something that she some incendiary device, and it went off and people were injured, including herself. That's where she got her skull fractures from. And at least one person was killed. So I think that kind of head injury probably set her off. And I think that she was also dealing with probably a good deal of survivor's guilt and just guilt for having dropped the bomb in the first place. And, I think that kind of drove her away from herself, if that makes sense.
Right. But I mean, in the hospitals, when she first started hinting around that she might be Anastasia, I think she was only doing it because the nurses paid her extra attention and they brought her extra magazines and they brought her extra candy. And so she got, some special favors from that. And as long as that sort of mystery continued, she didn't have to get up on the street and work again. She had people taking care of her, people giving her presents, and there was no pressure at that point. And it was all confined sort of to the hospital before the story spread from there. So I think in a lot of ways, it just started so she could get a few extra perks out of staying in the hospital.
And I suppose it went on because once she was deeply into it, she must have been worried about any kind of consequence for her if she was found out.
And there were certain things that happened that solidified for her supporters their belief that she was really Anastasia. Well, certain things that were purported to have happened. And one of those things that you write about is something called the piano story. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about the piano story?
Well, the piano story, I mean, it's a prime example of how her case evolved. She was staying at an apartment in Berlin, and this former Russian aristocrat, Zinaida Tolstoy, had come to see her, and she sat down, Zinaida Tolstoy did, at the piano and played some tunes and got up and left. That was it. Anna Anderson had been present for that, had given no indication that she recognized the tunes, but then her supporters claimed that when Tolstoy was playing the piano, Anna Anderson had suddenly burst into tears and recognized the song, and that it had been something that Tolstoy had played for the Grand Duchesses. And so obviously she was Anastasia because she had recognized it and had such an emotional reaction. Well, you go back to the original accounts surrounding that event, and you find that she didn't burst into tears. She gave no indication that she recognized any of the songs that were played. And, it's her supporters building kind of layer on layer of, oh, well, she must have recognized it. And then it morphs into, oh, she was so emotional when she recognized it. And then it gets repeated and elaborated until it becomes this myth. and that happened, the piano story, it happened with numerous things where she was said to have recognized this person or revealed this nickname or that name or spoken of a secret visit by the Grand Duke of Hesse to Russia in 1916. All of those things turned out to be without foundation, but her supporters kind of over the decades erased a lot of the lingering doubts about those things and presented only one side of the arguments, the side favorable to her. And so that just helped establish the legend even further.
Yeah. So would you tell us what happened with the case in the late 1980s and early 90s after the remains were exhumed? The conclusions that were made once their bones had been analyzed, and how were they able to test Anna Anderson's DNA, especially after she had been cremated?
Well, she did want to be cremated, and she was, and her ashes were interred in Germany. But at some point prior to her death, she had an operation, and during that operation, a section of her bowel, I believe it was retained by the operating surgeon and was held in a medical archive. And the scientists working on trying to identify her tracked down that piece of bowel, and they were able to extract DNA. There were also people who had hair from Anna Anderson. One woman in particular had bought a book that had once belonged to her and found inside an envelope full of Anna Anderson's hair. So that was also contributed to the scientific investigation. And between those two or three sources, they were able to obtain a DNA profile for Anna Anderson. And then, of course, that was matched to relatives of the real Anastasia, the known Anastasia, through her maternal line. So that actually brought it down to the late Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip. He contributed his DNA to match it because, of course, his grandmother had been Empress Alexandra's eldest sister. So they shared matrilineal descent. Empress Alexandra was the daughter of Princess Alice. Princess Alice's other daughter was Princess Victoria. Her daughter was Princess Alice, and her son was Philip. So they would have had the same mitochondrial DNA. And his mitochondrial DNA did not match Anna Anderson's. However, as another prong of that scientific investigation, the scientists researched and obtained a DNA profile of one Karl Maucher, who was a German citizen who was descended also in the matrilineal line from Franziska Shanskowska's mother. And his mitochondrial DNA did, in fact, match Anna Anderson. So right there, I mean, it was game, set, and match. That's who she was. And that's how the mystery came to an end. And I have to admit, I myself had gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on whether she was or wasn't for all those years. But in the end, that was the truth.
What was it that made you believe early on in your research that she was really Anastasia Romanov?
Well, I think for me, I mean, part of the problem is that history, popular history, only got one side of the story of this case. And we didn't really realize how lopsided the presentation of the facts of this case had been until we started researching this book and went back to the original source material and original notes and reports. You know, I mean, for me, things like her resemblance, the same height, the hallux valgus, the blue eyes, the supposed memories that she had of things that a pretender shouldn't have known and gotten correct about the Russian court. And, you know, as we learned, in fact, she didn't get much right when she was talking about the Russian court. But her early supporters swept all of that information under the rug and rewrote depositions and made claims that no, she had said this correct fact or made this correct identification of someone when in fact she hadn't. And so not knowing that we in history were essentially being lied to, it was easy to look at the case and think, it's so one-sided in her favor. And I think that that's part of the problem with the DNA. When the DNA results came out in 1994, they didn't do anything to address all of these other things, the human experience and her memories and the scars and those other things that made her so compelling a claimant. And that's really what we set out to do, was try to uncover the truth behind all of those other elements.
For me, it was the scars that she had or that she allegedly had, and the explanation for them, particularly the Russian bayonet scar. Also, for me, it was the people who did recognize her, because they were so sincere in their belief. And I really tried my best to, I think we both did, as part of this, we really tried to prove it was her before then going on to prove that it wasn't her.
I mean, we really would have loved to have written a book that overturned everything in this case and, was a bestseller and, but.
Right. But that was part of the process. Trying to prove that she was Anastasia helped us then break the case apart. Because like Greg said, once we realized the trickery that was going on behind the scenes, it all fell apart and it became very obvious who she was. And the DNA results were the cherry on top of that ice cream sundae.
When the grave was first discovered and the bones were examined, it appeared that Anastasia's remains were not with the rest of her family, right?
Right. I mean, they exhumed this mass grave outside of Yekaterinburg, and there should have been 11 bodies in it, but there were only 9. And the Russian and American scientists agreed that the body of Alexei was not there, but they vehemently disagreed about who else was missing. The Americans, left and right, every expert that went and examined the bones and took measurements in the graves, they all agreed that Anastasia was not in that grave. For the Russians, it became a matter of sort of wounded pride. They resented the fact that Anastasia had become a Western myth in their eyes, so they did everything they could to try to prove that they had Anastasia's body. And, that's the point of contention. And it wasn't until 2007 when another sweep through the area around the Four Brothers mine shaft in that forest found burnt, chopped bones, and they were forensically tested and matched with DNA to the remains previously found, that indeed the last 2 missing children were found. The Russians still insist that the body found in 2007 was that of Marie, and that they had found Anastasia in the original grave. But the Americans have been pretty insistent that no, the Russians are wrong, and it has to have been Anastasia who was found in 2007.
There's actually a really good book about this called Bones of Contention that was written by the late Dr. William Maples. He was one of the forensic anthropologists that went to Siberia to examine the bones, and his reason for believing that Anastasia was not in that grave was that the vertebra in the spinal columns of the 3 young female skeletons were simply too mature, too properly fused as adults to their growth rings to be anybody under the age of 18.
Right. And there were forensic anthropologists and then odontologists who examined the teeth. The teeth weren't fully developed, so they had to be someone around the age of 16 to 17. There were a whole host of indicators that suggested that Anastasia was missing in 1991 when that grave was exhumed, and that she was indeed found, as now everybody agrees, in 2007, except that the Russians, of course, still try to claim that they had Anastasia all along.
But it hardly matters at this point. Everybody is accounted for.
Right.
And there are still people, right, who refuse to believe.
The Russian Orthodox Church is probably the first in line for that.
Yeah, in Russia, there's a continuing argument. The remains that were exhumed in 1991 were buried in 1998 in St. Petersburg. That's the 9 of them, Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and the 4 servants killed with them. But the church refused to recognize them as the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and their daughters. The Orthodox Church canonized the family in 2000, but has consistently refused to recognize the validity of any DNA tests. There have been numerous DNA tests that have gone on since, and the position of the church is still that they have questions, they say. They raise all sorts of questions about whether it was a ritual Jewish murder, whether the bones were a KGB plant, and so there's a lot of that conspiratorial thinking that still goes on in Russia about those bones.
It's a hideous situation. The conspiracy theories that they come up with are backward-looking. They are easily disprovable. There's no reason not to accept the DNA results. However, the Orthodox Church does remain in possession of those bones because those 9 bodies were quietly exhumed from their graves in St. Petersburg, where they had been buried by permission of Yeltsin to some considerable pomp in the presence of current-day family members. They have been exhumed from there, put together with the 2 2007 bodies, and they are now being held in a monastery, I believe somewhere close to Moscow. So they essentially hold all the cards. They have the bodies, and they are not really moving very quickly towards resolving the situation. And I suppose people who are their supporters, members of that church, some of them, I know some of them don't, but I suppose some of them are looking to them for leadership in this situation. So I think that's pretty much how it stands. I think secularly speaking, I think most people do accept that those are indeed the bones and the mystery is now over.
I so appreciate you both coming back on for another interview. So I will put a link in the show notes to your Facebook page and your Twitter handle. Well, thanks again for your time.
Oh, no worries. That was a good time again. And just one last thing, I did look it up, and Nicholas did, in fact, according to Bob Massey, take a break after Anastasia was born and go out for a long walk to, quote unquote, compose himself.
Okay.
So I guess
either that or drinking before he faced the wife.
He tried to take it on the chin, but he had to go out for a walk first.
Well, again, it's been great. So glad to have you here.
Well, thanks again. And your podcast is one of the first ones I listen to every week. I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you. Again, I have been speaking to Penny Wilson and Greg King. They are the authors of The Resurrection of the Romanovs, Anastasia, Anna Anderson, and The World's Greatest Royal Mystery. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.